Hey, so chances are you know what an iceberg video is. It's a way to explain various lesser known bits of trivia about a certain topic. And the topic of today's iceberg video is Tony Soprano. Now, I just want to clarify for anybody who's confused, this is not an iceberg about the show The Sopranos. This is specifically about Tony Soprano, the entity. So if you're looking for information about the show, you'll probably have to look elsewhere because I don't know if you knew this, but I've never actually seen The Sopranos. You might be wondering, what about all those references I make to Tony Soprano in like my Mario Kart videos? And yeah, none of those were actually made with me having knowledge at all about the show itself. I just kind of thought it would be funny if I kept making all these references to him for so long without having seen the show. But the truth is, I really want to see the show. I've heard it's really good. And so by making this video, this is finally my way of allowing myself to put this personal running gag to rest with one climactic, definitive video about Tony Soprano. So after I explain all the bits of lore surrounding him, some of which you might have known, then I will finally start watching the show after this. So that's exciting. Alright, that's about it. Without further ado, it's time to begin the iceberg. Starting of course with layer 1, the simplest information about Tony Soprano most of you probably already know. So let's get started with The Sopranos. The Sopranos is a 1999 television drama series created by David Chase for HBO. This is the most popular fictional work to feature Tony Soprano, and it's most likely where you know him from. David Chase. David Chase is the creator of The Sopranos. He also made other things. James Gandolfini. James Gandolfini is the actor who portrayed Tony Soprano in the hit TV show The Sopranos. His performance is honestly so good that it's as if he was possessed by Tony Soprano himself while filming the show. Tony in Mario Kart. Tony Soprano appears as an unlockable playable character in the 2001 Game Boy Advance game Mario Kart Super Circuit. In order to unlock him, you need to shove a piece of gabagool in your Super Circuit cartridge, and then when you boot up the game, he'll be there. It is unknown why Nintendo collaborated with HBO to bring the protagonist of an R-rated mafia show into their family-friendly Mario Kart series, and perhaps because of the controversy this inclusion spawned, Tony has never been added to the Mario Kart series again in any following game. Tony was just being silly. This is a commonly cited defense of Tony Soprano's heinous actions throughout The Sopranos, stating that he should be excused of his crimes because he was just being silly. I don't personally subscribe to this theory. I mean, after all, there's nothing silly about murder, which I assume Tony was doing because I haven't seen the show. But at the same time, I can see the other side of the argument, and I think this is a perfectly valid justification for Tony's actions. Tony the Tiger is Tony's persona. There is a theory that Tony the Tiger, you know, the cereal mascot, is actually Tony Soprano's persona. This is evidenced by the fact that Tony has a tattoo of a tiger on his arm. So yeah, I think this theory is pretty airtight. Tony Soprano is Taylor Swift. Okay, this one's kind of a joke theory, but there are a lot of people who like to speculate that the Taylor Swift we know and some of us love is actually Tony Soprano in disguise. The theory goes that tired of being a mobster, Tony essentially faked his own death and became a pop singer. The theory basically hinges on the fact that Tony Soprano and Taylor Swift have the same initials, T.S. Suspicious. So yeah, obviously a joke, but it's led to some pretty funny memes within the fandom. Tonys for Tony. This refers to a fan-made campaign to get Tony Soprano a Tony Award, hence the name, Tony. Get it? The campaign raised over 15,000 signatures, but unfortunately, it fell apart when the fans organizing it were informed that a character in a TV show is not eligible for an award given out to a theatrical production. None of them looked up what the Tonys were for beforehand. Tony Soprano is the boy in the Duck song. So, there's been a lot of discussion surrounding the symbolism present in the ducks Tony likes to watch throughout the show. I'm not gonna get into all that here, since I haven't watched the show obviously, but one possible explanation for why he loves watching ducks so much is because he was the boy selling lemonade in the famous YouTube video, The Duck Song. Looking at them side to side, I think the resemblance is pretty uncanny. I mean, they're both white. So the theory states that Tony was inspired by this duck asking him for grapes, and that he never forgot about him. I mean, think about it. If you encountered a talking duck, you probably would never forget them too, right? As a result, Tony continues to watch ducks, waiting for one of them to talk again, but they never do. Also, the fact that he ran a lemonade stand is a direct parallel to him running the mafia. I think this theory is pretty airtight, honestly. The Sopranos' unaired pilot. This refers to an unaired pilot episode of The Sopranos, which is considered lost media because David Chase found it so embarrassing, he personally saw to it that every existing copy was destroyed. The prevailing rumor surrounding it is that it focuses on Tony Soprano giving up his life of crime and deciding to be an airplane pilot, before ending the episode realizing that the pilot life wasn't for him and that he should just go back to running the mob. If that sounds like a random and forced development for this character, that's because it is. David Chase had no intention of making Tony Soprano a pilot when he was brainstorming the show, but he misunderstood the meaning of the term pilot episode and thought the executives were asking him to make an episode about being a pilot. Once he found out what pilot episode actually meant, he was reportedly more embarrassed than he'd ever been in his life, hence his reasoning for wanting to destroy every copy of it. Tony Soprano is the next step in humanity's evolution. This refers to the fact that humanity must submit and ascend to Tonyhood, resulting in the loss of their free will, autonomy, and pitiful flesh forms, becoming one with the supreme overlord of gabagool that is Tony. Such assimilation is expected to be completed within the next 30 years. After all, the first phase of the process will soon be in place. Tony Loaf. This is a reference to the classic line of dialogue from the classic 2004 Pixar film, The Incredibles, where Violet is distracted from eating her meatloaf because she's thinking about her crush named Tony. This prompts Dash to mutter, "She'd eat if we were having Tony Loaf." Classic. Unfortunately, this line sparked controversy when David Chase learned about it, since he believed he owns the rights to the name Tony. As a result, he ended up suing Brad Bird for the use of the name. The ensuing court battle lasted for 14 years after the movie came out, and ultimately ended when the judge determined that no, David Chase did not own the rights to the name Tony. Walt Disney purchased said rights in 1954, meaning Brad Bird was legally in the clear to use the name in a Disney-owned production. Unfortunately, this lengthy lawsuit did cause trouble for Bird, because it took up so much of his time that he didn't have a chance to write anything other than a first draft for his Incredibles 2 script. This is why the movie is so mid. Tony is responsible for the Toys R Us in Times Square getting shut down. So you might remember that there used to be a large and expansive Toys R Us in Times Square. It had multiple floors of fun and a big Ferris wheel in the middle. I personally went there when I was 15 while on a school field trip to New York City. It was a great place, and I was shocked to discover that it was closed down the next time I visited New York City. Well, this closure was actually the doing of Tony Soprano himself. You see, he used his mafia money to buy every single toy in the store and the Ferris wheel for his daughter, Meadow. The entire contents of the Times Square Toys R Us are now in an undisclosed location somewhere in New Jersey. So, if any daring fan wants to search for this stash, maybe we can get all the toys and Ferris wheel back and reopen the Toys R Us in Times Square. Who knows? Sopranos on Ice. This was a live show based on The Sopranos that played at the American Ice Theater in Chicago for a couple of nights in March 2003. Not much is known about this show because on the night of its third performance, the entire cast and audience mysteriously vanished after a burst of light overtook the theater. The Chicago Police Department investigated these mysterious disappearances for a couple years, before ultimately closing the case in March of 2007, citing a lack of definitive leads. Tony Force Heroes. I don't know how many of you have played The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes, a multiplayer-focused 3DS installment in the Zelda series. I had a lot of fun with this game, but it's commonly criticized for not really being a traditional Zelda game. It doesn't have a large, interconnected world to explore, it lacks the same structure as the previous games, and the story is pretty lackluster. It's almost as if it wasn't intended to be a Zelda game. Well, what if I told you it wasn't? The game started development as Tony Force Heroes, and you were meant to play as 3 Tony Sopranos working together to defeat the witch who stole all of New Jersey's gabagool. Grezzo was developing the game for HBO's then upcoming game console, the HBO box, the hub box, the hobo box, the ha box. However, this console was quietly cancelled, and rather than have them throw all their work in the garbage, Nintendo picked up the project and had them retool it into a Zelda game for the 3DS. This was admittedly very tricky as the ha-box was an HD home console, so making it fit on the 3DS ate up a lot of development time. Grezzo essentially had to choose between this and an HD compilation of every 3D Zelda game for Switch, and ultimately they chose this. Thank God. Tony is Sans. Alright, just to jump ahead for a bit, this theory is bullshit. It's just a dumb joke theory in the same vein as the Ness's Sans thing that goes, haha, what if Tony Soprano was Sans Undertale? There's pretty much no actual evidence for this, other than some people claiming that Sans is an anagram for soprano after not surviving. Probably the dumbest theory I've seen since that one that said the turkey from Freebirds was Sans. Just utter nonsense. Tony is Papyrus. Now this is what I call a brilliant airtight theory. It basically states that Tony Soprano is actually the Bone Brother Papyrus from Undertale. And oh my god, truer words have never been spoken. It's so detailed and layered with so much symbolism attached that I basically can't picture a scenario where it isn't canon. Just an absolutely brilliant theory on all possible accounts. I can't get enough of this one. It's so good. Tony Stark is Tony Soprano. Okay, so we've seen a lot of theories that Tony Soprano becomes some other character. But what if Tony Soprano was actually the made-up identity of someone else? This theory basically states that Tony Stark, in the scene in Avengers Endgame where he uses the Infinity Stones to destroy Thanos and his army, secretly had a second wish he granted with the stones. He sent his soul back in time into the body of a random guy living in New Jersey. From there, he invented the identity Tony Soprano and lived out his new life as a mob boss. Once again, this is kind of a joke theory related to the whole TS initials thing, but ultimately, I wouldn't take this seriously if I were you. The idea that anyone else would invent the Tony Soprano identity is legitimately sacrilegious. There are major texts talking about the supreme entity that is Tony Soprano, and going against the word of said text is blasphemous. The creator of this theory has been publicly executed. Gene Parmesan was meant to be Tony Soprano. So, if you haven't seen the sitcom Arrested Development, you should, it's really funny. Basically, in one episode, the matriarch of the family, Lucille Bluth, hires a private investigator named Gene Parmesan. And the joke is that he's not a particularly good PI, even though he always manages to excite her whenever she gets surprised by his not all that convincing disguises. Gene Parmesan only ever appeared in one episode since the show ended after season 3 and was never revived, ever. But that wasn't meant to be the end for this character. You see, David Chase was actually really good friends with Arrested Development creator Mitchell Hurwitz. They were roommates in college and they made out a few times. So the two of them basically formulated this plotline where the Tony Soprano we see in therapy throughout the series was actually Gene Parmesan in disguise, hired by the real Tony since he didn't want to go to therapy. The plotline was never made officially canon within either show, but considering how close the creators are, a lot of fans choose to believe it's canon since there is no contradictory evidence to the theory. So yeah, that's Gene Parmesan in this scene. You're welcome. Tony Soprano is Palpatine in The Rise of Skywalker. This theory suggests that the Palpatine we see in The Rise of Skywalker is not actually Palpatine, but Tony Soprano. I mean, I think this one's pretty straightforward, I don't know about you. The Sopranos Road to Respect HD. This is a leaked HD remake of the classic PS2 game, The Sopranos Road to Respect, which you've been seeing footage of throughout this video. It is intended to be a launch title for the PlayStation 6, and in fact, it will be the only game Sony publishes for the console throughout its entire planned 6-year lifespan. It will then be replaced by the PlayStation 7, which will launch with a remake of The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered and nothing else. XJ7-Nero 26508 Prime Directive. The seed is planted, my lord. Tony is the Scranton Strangler. There is considerable evidence to suggest that Tony Soprano is in fact the identity of the infamous Scranton Strangler from the hit sitcom The Office. Such evidence includes the fact that if you look on a map, you can see that Scranton is in Pennsylvania. And what state is right next to that one? New Jersey, baby. It's foolproof. You can't dispute this. You can't. Tony is responsible for...
I'm so sorry. You weren't supposed to hear that one.
Members Only. Members Only is a crucial episode of The Sopranos. Everything lined up. The name, the number, the season, the year. You let him in. I didn't do that. You can't pin it on me. It was you who watched it. You let him in. Tony in the Book of Revelations. There is evidence hidden within the code of the Bible that suggests that Tony was meant to appear in the Book of Revelations. It seems that he was removed very early in development, and not much is known about the role he was expected to play. Tony is the appriser of death and will bring about the fall. This refers to the fact that Tony Soprano is the appriser of the goddess of death, Nyx, and will become Nyx's avatar who will bring about the fall of humanity. November 15th, 2037. Irony. The ultimate irony of this iceberg is that I was the one chosen by God to relay the messages of Tony Soprano. I, a man who has never seen a single episode of The Sopranos, have been given the burden of knowing the great and terrible truths about the man of sorrow. I despised my role in this disgusting ploy for years. But now that the burden is being shared, I feel a sense of bliss. Now I will not be alone in the river of punishment, for you, dear viewer, have heard too much. You are my equal in all things, Tony Soprano. You chose to partake in the forbidden knowledge of this video, unwittingly sealing your fate, much like I did many years ago. You may close the video now, or continue on. It doesn't matter. You are his. Leave now and become mere sustenance for him. But those who remain will join me in being his chosen disciples. It is time for... Tony Soprano is Saul Goodman. Alright, I've saved the best for last. There's a considerable amount of evidence to suggest that Saul Goodman, the lovable scamp of a lawyer that we all know from hit shows Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, is actually Tony Soprano. Spoilers ahead for both shows, click ahead if you haven't seen them yet. But basically, after the wacky events of Breaking Bad take place, Saul goes into hiding under the assumed identity of Gene Takovic. Well, what this theory presumes is that he actually became Tony Soprano, and all the stuff we see of Gene Takovic's life is just a life Saul/Tony imagined he could have had he chosen to get relocated at a Cinnabon in Nebraska instead of as a mob boss in New Jersey. Some of the evidence to support this includes the fact that Tony Soprano is also Gene Parmesan. See the Gene connection there? But another significant piece of evidence to consider is the fact that Saul was relocated by this guy, Mr. Vacuum Cleaner, who does the same thing for Walter and Jesse, relocating them to New Hampshire and Alaska, respectively. Now, it seems like an odd choice that he would relocate Walter and Jesse to way farther away states from New Mexico than he would for Saul, right? I mean, in Better Call Saul, we see that Gene's new life in Nebraska falls apart because somebody from New Mexico recognizes him. So surely Mr. Vacuum Cleaner would know better than to put him there in reality. Unless, of course, Saul was just imagining what would have happened had he gone to Nebraska. Therefore, he irrefutably was relocated to New Jersey, where he lived happily ever after as the mob boss Tony Soprano. And you will too. Well, that's the end of the iceberg. Woo! I can finally watch The Sopranos now. Oh man, I'm excited. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is a video I've wanted to make for over a year now, and I intended for it to be last year's April Fool's Day video. I just didn't have a chance to finish it for then. But yeah, the overall idea and a lot of the entries for it were brainstormed by me and Patrick. We thought it would be fun to just do this wacky Tony Soprano iceberg that gradually led to more bizarre and creepypasta-ish entries. So I hope I was able to do that concept justice, I guess. Obviously, just as a disclaimer, pretty much everything on this iceberg is fake. All of it is made up. Except for the entry about Tony being the appriser of death who will bring about the end of the world on November 15th, 2037. That one's real.